Hi. What if I did the videos like this? That would be weird. I'm not going to do that to you. Oh, what's up? Stand up. What's up? Stand up. Um, as things are winding down here, I'm getting a little misty doing these videos. That's funny. Um, but I have a job to do, and like tens of you watch these, so it's for you guys. It's for the diehards. It's for the hardcore stand up nation fam. Um, Ramy Youssef, Ramy. Um, as I explained to class, like one of the beauties of this course and a lot of my courses is the fact that the the content is ever sort of changing and evolving, and I can make decisions about the content of the course, minutes before the course starts, before the classes start. And this was one. I had planned to show you somebody else um, last week. I was like, this the the class and our discussions and things like that just had this kind of momentum that I felt would have been um, abruptly stopped had I not shown Ramy Youssef. I felt like he continued this kind of cool momentum that we were caught in the midst of. Um, and I was right. I was right to do that. So this is the first time I've shown Ramy Youssef in class, and I'm happy I did. So just a little background on him. Sorry for you guys who heard this already, but he kind of came out of nowhere in a really impressive way. So he got a Hulu show, an eponymous Hulu show called Ramy, and he wrote, directed, starred in, and won a Golden Globe for as best actor in a comedy or whatever. Like basically off of nothing. I mean, he was doing stand up, but like it wasn't like he was a huge stand up name. And the special that we watched premiered, I think, like within 5 days of the premiere episode of Ramy, the show. So I was like, who the fuck is this guy, right? Um, so that's a cool story. Like that's also how talented. It's clearly how talented the guy is. Um, but I did a little digging, as is my wont. Um, he was a regular on the Nickelodeon show See Dad Run, starring Scott Baio. So there's that. That might have been what launched his career. Um, so I just it's that's just I mean as crazy as like the Bo Burnham story is, where he was like doing cheesy YouTube videos at like 17 years old, and then just they were like, yeah, just turned into Bo Burnham. I feel like Ramy's story is it's as impressive and interesting, um, and sort of like inspiring, I think. So his comedy, as many of you mentioned in the comments, it hits different. and we talked about this stuff in class too, but um, he's not afraid of space. He's not afraid of silence. He's not afraid of, you know, the, he's not afraid of thought, I guess, is one way to look at it. In fact, I think he uses space and silence and timing to let the audience absorb it, to let them think, to let them sort of ponder the things that he's talking about, because you get the feeling, is probably not what's happening, but you get the feeling that he too is taking that time to reflect and ponder and really think about what he wants to say, right? It's almost a calculated silence where he's being introspective and contemplative. Um, and that's, as many of you mentioned, again, it's a downshift from most of the comedians that we've watched before him. There's an intensity to stand up that we've sort of become accustomed to, and it's embodied by Jim Jeffries and Margaret Cho and Hicks and Carlin and um, obviously Dice and Kinnison, even back to Pryor. Like there's an energy and an intensity um, that Ramy seems to avoid, and I think that is tactical. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But many of you mentioned that it hits you differently. It's um, the silence is deafening. Yeah, no, maybe not. Who wrote the comment? Shoot, where did I see that? It's like, yeah, Evan. Evan made the point about his tone and just his pacing and his cadence and his sort of that relaxed, sort of laid back thing. It's kind of like people who talk about comedians that work clean, that they don't curse, they don't do any material like Seinfeld or Jim Gaffigan or something like that. And a lot of people like to talk about how that's true comedy. Like if they don't have to resort to, you know, saying fuck and, doing all these kinds of antics, sensationalized antics, that's more impressive, right? Working clean versus working blue. I feel like this is a similar paradigm where it's like he doesn't have to scream his points at you to get them across, right? It takes more savvy and poise and skill to convey his ideas in this more relaxed way than a guy who is just screaming at you for an hour. Like it kind of has that same connotation for me, like working clean versus working blue, working chill versus working intense, right? Yeah, I hope you guys understood that because it came to me. Evan's comment kind of made me think of it. Um, so the show itself is just it's it's different and it's in a really good way and different. What was it? Who made that comment? Ben. This was my summary of Ben's comment. It doesn't make him better. It makes him different, and some people prefer different. If that makes any sense. I don't think it's better or worse than Jim Jeffries or Bill Hicks or whatever. It's definitely different though, right? And um, I think a lot of that appeals to a lot of people. One of the quotes he started off with was, "I've been thinking a lot about how we know what we know, right? Where we get our information from, social media and 24-hour news and like all this other stuff, and how we treat people as a result of that. Like that was such a kind of interesting and complex way to look at the relationship between how we know what we know and how that impacts our relationships with other people. Like that seems to be a theme throughout the special that is certainly uh, um, worth exploring. Um, a bunch of you mentioned like the venue, just the way it's kind of in the round. The audience is more on his level, right? It's very conversational, extemporaneous. It just feels like the venue is the Chicago Cultural Center. So even that like gives gives a different vibe to the whole show, right? And I think is a metaphor for the whole show about the cultural center, and it's not typically a stand up. Certainly isn't a stand up venue, but even the venue itself is conveying this kind of very subtle message, um, and I think helps shape some of his some of his material and the thrust of some of his material. Um, he talks about doing something with the moment, right? He uses the Jussie Smollett story, like do something with the moment, and then that's his big callback joke at the end too. But I just like that ethos, like do something with the moment. Like if you're gonna be famous, like do something with that. For whatever reason you might be famous, like do something with it. Um, and I think that is a creed, a credo of good comedy, don't you think? Like I'm I'm on this stage, like people are listening to me. I, it's a metaphor for that. Like why would I not like do something with that moment? I think it's a good comedy thing, not a comedy thing for the most part. But I mean, pretty much everybody we watched, I feel like, is doing something with the moment, and the moment in this case is being on stage or being a professional comedian or a famous comedian, as it were. Um, I don't know if he. I don't know why I wrote this down. Comedy is the most difficult genre. Did he say something about that? It's true, but um, I think I made the connection to math. I always use it's kind of a cutesy little anecdote I usually use at the beginning of the semester. I can't remember if I did to you guys, but you know, or all the shit that humor gets in academia, especially like, oh, why bother even studying it? It's super stupid, it's silly. Um, my argument is it's far more complex than math. Math you can teach to anybody, pretty much, right? Basic math you can teach anybody. You can't teach people how to be funny. Um, you can't do it. Like, and jokes, like really good jokes, are way more complex than a lot of math theorems. Is that a word? Is that a math? Theorems or formulas or whatever. In other words, there is an answer, right? It's empirical. Math is this. If you do this, you get an answer. Comedy, humor it's completely subjective. It in, it requires an understanding of language and context and tone um, and a knowledge of culture that math doesn't even touch. And the even the funniest person in the world only has a sense of humor. Um, just a sense of it. Like nobody has it figured out. Um, I don't know why. I can't remember the joke that made me think of this kind of stuff. Um, I mentioned this before. Like he's such a departure from the comedy we've been watching in class, right? Laid back, pensive, contemplative, space, pacing. It's just a different animal. Um, and I think a lot of times we as a culture want to get into the better or worse argument rather than the uh, same different argument. If that makes any sense. And that was back to what Ben was saying, right? I don't think that his style is better than Jim Jeffries, Bill Hicks, blah, 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 Margaret Cho. I think it's different. And I think most people are. We don't typically embrace difference. We should, right? We should. We should greet difference with open arms instead of closed fists. It's another one of my little catchphrases. Um, yeah, and this is definitely a different approach than we've seen. Um, and a worthwhile one, I think. Just the idea that he can get to the same ideas and important issues in this manner as Jim Jeffries can in his man. You know what I mean? Um, so that I enjoyed. I did enjoy it. Many of you were like, that is appealing. You know, so like, yeah, why don't more people do it? I guess they're probably not quite equipped to do it. Um, what else we got here? Um, Believing in God is a loaded statement. I loved that when he got into his religion. I mean, he really explored being Muslim, I think, for um, not just for himself and Muslims, but for non-Muslims. I mean, that like the jokes that he does about prayer on Fridays and all that kind of stuff. Like I didn't know that stuff. And as I mentioned before, I think I mentioned it in this class in reference to my funny women class when we were talking about comedy being relatable. Like this is a perfect example. Like he's trying to comedy is always trying to relate to us. It's up to us to not shut down because it's not relatable. It's relating requires a listening. Um, so like if we're not going to listen to someone who's trying to relate to us, yeah, it's not going to be relatable. Does that make sense? Like it's about comedy is about relating to otherness or other people. Um, so all the Muslim stuff that he did was his attempt to relate that experience to non-Muslims, I think, and to I guess commiserate with Muslims. So the Muslims in the room are, you know, laughing and oh yeah, so true, like that kind of thing. And we are selling ourselves short as non-Muslims if we're going to be like, oh, this is about Muslims. Oh, I don't need to listen. But that is sort of our default in many cases. Whereas we should be listening to learn more about it, to, as Adelia was saying, like, understand that Muslim isn't a monolith. It's not, there's not just one kind of Muslim, you know? Um, and it's as intricate and 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 enriching and sort of, you know, meaningful to as our whatever religion you might be, right? Um, and he kind of ties that theme in with a lot of his jokes about being Muslim, and I think it definitely works. Um, I love his joke, like similar to like Minhaj's joke about, right. Basically, his closer is, I solved racism, right, with this Bethany Reed story and the ending to that story, and like he kind of has that moment where he's like, you know, it sounds like I solved racism, right? Right? I need to date as many white women and be introduced to their mothers so that they can see that, yeah. Um, Very similar jokes, but I think effective effective in different ways, right? Um, I think that shows a little bit of the diversity of comedy and humor, right? That you can have these two guys doing a similar joke. I don't think they're ripped off or stolen or whatever. Obviously, they're way too personal, I think, for that to be the case. Um, but I think it's interesting to see the different sort of approaches to a similar topic from, again, I think, again, gives some depth to what I mean, to being Muslim, um, if nothing else. He talks a lot about being a representative of your community, like how it's true, but it's probably not fair, right? It's really not fair to say, well, you're the spokesperson for the black people now because you're famous and you talk about shit, or you're the spokesperson for Muslims, or you're the spokesperson. It's a lot of weight. It's a lot to carry with you. Um, and he would admit, like, I'm as flawed as anybody. Like, I don't, I don't want that responsibility. That's heavy. Um, Many of you commented on the "why do you make her wear that" joke, which is, it's just chef's kiss. Such a good joke, and explores a lot of different ideas. And somebody brought it up. Who was talking about it? Um, Shoot. Ellie was talking about the way he uses it to basically expose this ethnocentrism that we we're all, I think we're all guilty of, um, which was a good point to make. Where the fuck is it? Oh yeah, right here. Is it Kathleen's comment? I guess just jogged my memory, because I don't think he's saying with the hijab and our obsession with it and how it's this sort of marker of oppression. I don't think he's saying it's not oppressive. I think he's saying, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think he's saying oppression looks different. Like, right. He's making the connection between, like, what we see as oppressive is just different. It's like, it's no more oppressive than making a white girl, or an American, I guess, you know, wear a skirt and heels and no coat in 7-degree weather, right? Out of some obligation to society or men or whatever it is. Like, he's these systems of oppression, they just kind of look differently. Um, I guess he does later say, like, it's not oppress, it's not necessarily oppressive. He does it leads him to this quote, right? Just because it's different or you don't understand it doesn't mean it's oppressive. Like that, I thought that was an interesting way to look at it. He might think that it is, right? But I think the focus of that joke is like, how about you work on the systems of oppression in your own country first before you start saying, how awful my people are, right? Um, that that joke works on a bunch of different levels, and I think he does it really well. It's just a really good joke. Um, his whole thing about Trump is a feeling. Like that's a great approach. It's so difficult to do Trump stuff and not just sound like, you know, just a hacky comedian. It's because it's so easy, such an easy target, and there's very few jokes or comedians who do any Trump stuff that's like got any depth. Mulaney does the bit about the horse in a hospital, which is the best stuff, Trump stuff that I've ever seen because he's not, you know, he's not just taking the easy shots at Trump that everybody makes, but the whole Trump as a feeling, I think, was an interesting approach to doing Trump material without being a complete hack. Um, oh, just because you don't get it doesn't mean it's oppressive. That's the line. I jotted it down. We're afraid of what we don't know. Duh. Sadly, um, and this is what I think it's really meta about his show. He's talking a lot about we're afraid of what we don't know. But now that you've listened to his show, you know more. So you shouldn't be afraid. Does that make sense? Like about being Muslim, let's say. We're afraid of that because we don't understand it. We don't know about it. Well, if you've watched this special, you now know more about it. So you should be less afraid of it. Um, that, yeah, that's sort of a mind fuck that I think only works if the audience is, again, sort of listening. Um, Shutting down when we hear what we don't like, right? And this line, I mentioned this in class too. I wrote it in all caps. Like his line, I had to find out if that was true, right? He had to find out if that was true. And I think more of us need to do that. We need to get to the bottom of things, and it might not be fun or uh, whatever, but I think that's uh, a principle that a lot of comedy is based on, is finding out if it's true, whatever it might be. So your comments, I mentioned a bunch of them already, but Alyssa, I liked your lean in closer um, description, like in terms of his delivery and his sort of laid back, sort of reserved, very calm, very um, slow paced delivery. You used the term like I felt myself having to lean in closer and pay better attention than if somebody was, just turned it up to 11 and fucking was screamed it at me. Um, and I agree. I liked the lean in closer um, tag. Like, yeah, it's sort of, I don't know, it gives a little more weight to what he's saying too. Like, oh, this must be important. Yeah, hopefully everybody is leaning in a little bit closer. I mentioned the ethnocentrism, right, which is tied into the why do you make them wear that thing from Ellie. That was a great point. Parth Parth was talking about just as the ex and everybody in the comments commented on the ethnos or not ethnocentric, the extemporaneous nature, right? The conversational tone of this. It's like, oh, it's like he's we're just hanging out with your friend or whatever. Um, but Parth was also talking about how he and Adelia did too, like giving some depth to how we define Muslims. Like that Muslims aren't a thing. There's no one way to be a thing, right? Um, but also how our culture wants to fight against that notion, right? You can be Muslim, but just be the kind of Muslim that I'm comfortable with. Like that's what America generally feels like. You can be black, but just be you have to be this kind of black person. You have to, be a stereotype basically. And then we're cool, right? If you're, you know, play basketball and you're into rap or Muslims, you have to have I don't know, a turban and a beard. Like it's all misinformed, right? But that's what we want. So when you break that or we find out that it's more than that, that's disruptive to our little cozy, generally shitty point of view. Um, Kathleen, I just liked how you said he brings attention to social issues I might not be paying attention to. Like that's a healthy way to look at it. It's like, man, back to my old a credo. I never thought of it that way, and I thought that was an interesting way to look at it. I mentioned Ben, right? His delivery and his whole thing, it doesn't make him better. It makes him different, and some people prefer different, right, than the the standard. Um, Evan, oh, the working clean thing. That's what I mentioned that before. And then Paulina, right? Paulina Paulina talked about understanding, right? Like you told a little story. I could see myself sitting in a bar talking about everything, and him being the kind of person who's like willing to admit that he's wrong, willing to be understanding if he disagrees with what you're saying. Like all those kinds of things, I think are inherent to comedy in general. And I've talked about it a little bit, but there's humility in that, and that's what separates it from most other forms of discourse. There's a humility in being able, I mean, a bunch of you mentioned that too, like how he says, I don't know, right? Repeatedly throughout the show has this, I don't know. Um, yeah, the arrogance of certitude, right, is something that has, crippled American culture for years and years and decades. Um, but he has this understanding, humble way of communicating that I think is inherent to comedy. Um, and I mean, that resonates with everybody or most people on an emotional level. Um, Adelia talks about Muslim diversity and how, yeah, we can draw comparisons between Hassan and Ramy, but I think it's better to focus on how different they are, right? To give some depth to our very sort of closed definition of Muslim. Um, and that tied into Parth's comment too. And then Lindsay, I guess, this is back to Paulina's comment about, the whole I don't know, right? It's a constant theme throughout the whole thing. And there's humility in that. Um, We could all be more humble. Trust me. All right. So that's Ramy. Thanks for playing. Uh, I'll see you guys soon.